Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had seen enough combat to know when something felt wrong. The radio crackled with static as she adjusted her position behind the concrete barrier, scanning the dusty street through her rifle scope. Her unit had been stationed in this small Afghan village for 3 months, and today was supposed to be their final patrol before rotating home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marketplace, where local vendors had begun setting up their stalls. Children running between the colorful displays of fruit and fabric. "Rodriguez, you seeing anything unusual out there?" came the voice of Lieutenant Thompson through her earpiece. She swept her scope across the rooftops one more time, noting the absence of the usual morning activities. No women hanging laundry, no elderly men gathering for their customary tea and conversation. The silence felt heavy, oppressive. Maria had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now they were screaming danger. "Negative, sir, but something's off. Too quiet for a Tuesday morning," she replied, her finger hovering near the trigger guard. Her fellow soldiers, Jackson and Williams, were positioned at the other end of the street, providing overwatch while the rest of the squad conducted their routine security check of the local school. This was supposed to be a goodwill mission, distributing supplies to the children and checking on the new playground equipment they'd helped install last month. The radio crackled again, this time with the voice of command. "All units, be advised we have intelligence suggesting possible hostile activity in your sector. Maintain heightened awareness and report any suspicious movement immediately." Maria's jaw tightened. Intelligence was often vague and sometimes wrong, but it was all they had to go on. She'd seen too many good soldiers come home in boxes because someone had dismissed a feeling or ignored a warning. As she continued her surveillance, Maria noticed a figure moving erratically near the school building. Through her scope, she could make out an elderly civilian, possibly in his 70s, stumbling as if injured or disoriented. The man appeared to be calling out, though she couldn't hear his words over the distance. Her training told her to report suspicious activity, but her humanity recognized someone in distress. This was the constant tension every soldier faced in these situations. The balance between security protocols and basic human compassion. "Thompson, I've got a civilian male, elderly, appears to be in distress near the school building, requesting permission to investigate," she transmitted, already knowing what the response would be. Standard operating procedure dictated maintaining position until the area was cleared by the main unit. But something about the man's desperate movements made her stomach clench with worry. The response came swiftly. "Negative, Rodriguez. Maintain position. We'll handle civilian contact once the area is secure." Maria watched through her scope as the elderly man continued to stumble, his movements becoming more frantic. She could see now that he was clutching something to his chest, and blood was seeping through his traditional Afghan clothing. Whatever had happened to him, he needed immediate medical attention. The radio erupted with urgent chatter as her squadmates reported movement in multiple buildings. The situation was escalating rapidly, and Maria found herself torn between her duty to her position and her growing concern for the injured civilian who seemed to be trying to reach the school where children might still be present despite the early hour. Jackson's voice cut through the radio static with barely controlled panic. Contact! Multiple hostiles on the rooftop, Building 37 Alpha. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed through the narrow streets as the morning's quiet was shattered by the chaos of combat. Maria's training kicked in automatically, her body moving with practiced efficiency as she acquired targets through her scope. The elderly civilian was now directly in the line of fire, trapped between her position and the hostile forces that had revealed themselves. "Civilian in the crossfire," she shouted into her radio, hoping someone could coordinate a rescue while she provided covering fire. But as she watched through her scope, she realized the man wasn't running for cover, he was running toward the school, toward what she now realized might be children inside. The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't a random attack. The timing, the positioning, the civilians' desperate attempt to reach the school, someone had planned this. Her finger found the trigger as she engaged the hostile targets, each shot calculated and precise. But with every round she fired, she was acutely aware of her dwindling ammunition supply. Standard combat load was limited, and prolonged engagements could leave a soldier defenseless. As she dropped another hostile fighter, Maria performed a quick ammunition check. 7 rounds remaining. In a firefight, 7 rounds could disappear in seconds. The elderly civilian had reached the school entrance and was pounding on the doors, his voice now audible even over the gunfire. Maria couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable: warning, urgency, fear. He was trying to warn someone, possibly the children or teachers who might be inside preparing for the day's lessons. Maria's respect for the man's courage grew as she watched him risk his life to alert others to the danger. "Rodriguez, status report." Thompson's voice crackled through the chaos. She could hear the stress in his voice, the weight of command during a firefight. Every decision could mean the difference between soldiers going home to their families or not. Maria acquired another target, a fighter who had emerged from a doorway 50 meters from the school. She squeezed the trigger, watched him fall, then reported her status. 6 rounds remaining, sir. Civilian is attempting to warn people at the school. Recommend immediate evacuation of the building. Even as she spoke, Maria was calculating angles, distances, and possibilities. 6 rounds against an unknown number of hostiles wasn't good odds, but this was what they trained for, what they signed up for when they took the oath to defend others. The sound of children's voices reached her ears, high-pitched and frightened. The school wasn't empty after all. Maria's heart clenched as she realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just an ambush on her patrol. It was an attack specifically targeting the children they'd been helping. The playground equipment, the supplies, the trust they'd built with the community, all of it had been used to create this moment of vulnerability. Through her scope, she watched as the elderly civilian managed to get the school doors open. Children began emerging, their teacher herding them toward what she hoped was safety. But the hostile fighters had noticed the evacuation too, and Maria could see them adjusting their positions to target the fleeing children. Her jaw clenched with determination. 6 rounds. She had to make each one count. The next few minutes blurred together in a haze of controlled violence and desperate precision. Maria engaged target after target, each shot reducing her ammunition supply while hopefully increasing the chances of the children's survival. 4 rounds. 3, 2. Each trigger pull was a calculated risk, a bet that this shot would matter more than saving the ammunition for later. But there might not be a later if those children didn't make it to safety. 1 round left. Maria held her breath as she watched the last group of children running across the courtyard toward the relative safety of the market area. The elderly civilian was with them, somehow still on his feet despite his injuries, helping to guide them away from the danger. But there was still one hostile fighter in position to target the group, and Maria had only 1 bullet left to stop him. The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. 1 bullet. She could save it for personal protection, follow standard protocol, and hope backup arrived in time. Or she could take the shot and trust that her training, her team, and maybe a little luck would see her through whatever came next. The hostile fighter was raising his weapon toward the fleeing children. Maria's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot rang out across the courtyard, and through her scope, Maria watched the final hostile fighter fall. Her rifle clicked empty as she attempted to chamber another round, a sound every soldier dreaded. She was now effectively defenseless except for her sidearm, and the knowledge that her last bullet had likely saved innocent lives. The elderly civilian looked up toward her position, and even across the distance, she could see him nod in what might have been acknowledgement or gratitude. Rodriguez, report. Thompson's voice was strained with concern. The gunfire had stopped, but the silence felt fragile, temporary. Maria knew from experience that quiet periods during firefights could be just as dangerous as the active combat. They often meant the enemy was repositioning or preparing for another assault. She quickly reloaded her rifle with her spare magazine, grateful for the standard practice of carrying backup ammunition. All clear on my sector, sir. Civilian evacuation successful. Hostile forces appear to be neutralized in my area. As she spoke, Maria continued to scan the surrounding buildings through her scope. The elderly civilian had collapsed near the market area, finally succumbing to his injuries but having successfully warned the children and helped them escape. His sacrifice would not be forgotten, and Maria made a mental note to ensure his actions were properly documented in her after-action report. The radio crackled with reports from other positions. Jackson and Williams had also encountered hostile forces, but had managed to suppress them without casualties. The main unit at the school confirmed that all children and staff had been evacuated safely. As the immediate danger passed, Maria allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. Her decision to use her last bullet to protect civilians had worked out, but it easily could have gone differently. Lieutenant Thompson's voice came through the radio with a mixture of relief and concern. All units, prepare for potential follow-up attack. Command is sending reinforcements and medical support. ETA 15 minutes. Maria acknowledged the transmission while maintaining her overwatch position. 15 minutes could feel like hours in a combat situation, and she wasn't about to let her guard down until help arrived. As she continued her surveillance, Maria thought about the elderly civilian who had given his life to warn the children. She didn't know his name, his story, or what had driven him to risk everything for others. But his actions had reminded her why she wore the uniform, why she had volunteered for this deployment. Sometimes the mission wasn't about following orders or completing objectives. Sometimes it was about making split-second decisions that defined who you were as a person. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air, and Maria felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Reinforcements were arriving. Medical teams would tend to any wounded, and the immediate crisis was over. But she knew that the memory of this morning would stay with her long after she returned home. The weight of decisions made in combat, the responsibility for others' lives, the knowledge that courage could come from the most unexpected places, these were the things that would follow her. Through her scope, she watched as medical personnel attended to the elderly civilian. Maria hoped he would survive, that his brave actions would be rewarded with the chance to see his family again. But even if he didn't make it, his sacrifice had meaning. The children were safe, her fellow soldiers were unharmed, and the mission would continue. Sometimes that was all you could ask for in a war zone. The reinforcements secured the area quickly and efficiently, their presence allowing Maria's unit to finally stand down from their combat positions. As she cleaned her rifle and prepared for the inevitable debrief, Maria reflected on the morning's events. The decision to use her last bullet to protect civilians had been instinctive, based on training and values rather than calculation. But it had been the right choice, both tactically and morally. Lieutenant Thompson approached her position, his face showing the strain of command during crisis. "Good work out there, Rodriguez. That civilian you protected, he's going to make it. Medical team says he was hit by shrapnel from an IED that went off prematurely. That's probably what alerted him to the attack in the first place." Maria nodded, grateful for the update. Knowing that the man would survive added another layer of meaning to the morning's events. "Sir, About the ammunition situation, Maria began, ready to explain her decision to use her last bullet. But Thompson held up a hand, stopping her. Already talked to command. They're recommending you for commendation. Using your last round to protect civilians while maintaining tactical awareness shows exactly the kind of judgment we need in situations like this. Maria felt a mixture of pride and humility. Recognition was nice, but knowing she had made the right choice was more important. As the unit prepared to move out, Maria took one last look at the school where children had been playing just hours before. The playground equipment they had installed was still there, waiting for the day when it would be safe for children to play again. The morning's attack had been repelled, but the underlying tensions that had caused it remained. This was the reality of their deployment, small victories against a backdrop of ongoing conflict. The helicopter ride back to base gave Maria time to process everything that had happened. She thought about the elderly civilians' courage, about the children who had escaped harm, about the split-second decisions that had shaped the morning's outcome. War was often described in terms of strategy and tactics, but at its core, it was about human choices, the choice to risk everything for others, to stand up against injustice, to protect the innocent even when the cost was high. Back at base, the debriefing process was thorough but routine. Maria recounted the events objectively, focusing on facts and timelines rather than emotions. But privately, she knew this mission would stay with her in ways that others hadn't. The image of the elderly civilian running toward danger to warn the children, the weight of making that final shot with her last bullet, the knowledge that her actions had directly saved lives. These were the moments that defined not just her military service, but her character. That evening, as she wrote in her journal, Maria tried to capture the complexity of what had happened. Today, I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. An elderly civilian taught me that lesson more clearly than any training manual ever could. When I used my last bullet to protect those children, I wasn't thinking about regulations or protocols. I was thinking about what was right. The weeks that followed brought routine patrols and standard operations, but Maria found herself changed by the experience. She approached each mission with the same professionalism, but with a deeper understanding of why her role mattered. The elderly civilian's actions had reminded her that heroism could come from anyone, anywhere, at any time. Her job was to be ready when those moments arrived, to make the choices that aligned with her values and training. As her deployment neared its end, Maria received word that the elderly civilian, whose name she learned was Ahmed Hassan, had not only survived but had requested to meet with her. The meeting was arranged through the proper channels, with translators and security protocols in place. When they finally met, Hassan's first words, translated carefully, were simple. "Thank you for protecting our children. Your last bullet saved more than you know." Maria struggled to find the right words to respond. Through the translator, she said, You were the one who saved them. You risked everything to warn them. I just helped where I could." Hassan smiled, an expression that seemed to carry the weight of years and experiences Maria could only imagine. "We both did what we had to do. That is what good people do when children are in danger." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Hassan sharing stories about the children Maria had helped protect. Many were students he had taught years ago. Others were grandchildren of friends. The school represented hope for the future, a place where the next generation could learn and grow beyond the conflicts that had shaped their parents' lives. The attack had been an attempt to destroy that hope, but it had failed. As Maria prepared to leave Afghanistan, she carried with her not just the memories of combat and conflict, but also the knowledge that her service had made a real difference. The decision to use her last bullet to protect civilians had been just one moment in a long deployment, but it had encapsulated everything she believed about her role as a soldier. Sometimes protecting others meant taking risks, making sacrifices, and trusting that training and values would guide you to the right choice. The flight home was long and contemplative. Maria thought about Hassan, about the children who were now safe, about the school that continued to operate despite the attack. She thought about her fellow soldiers who had stood with her during the firefight, about the chain of decisions and actions that had led to the successful outcome. War was chaos, but within that chaos, individuals could still make choices that mattered. Months later, back in civilian life, Maria received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of children playing on the playground equipment her unit had installed, along with a note in careful English. "The children you saved are learning and growing. They will remember that someone cared enough to protect them. Thank you for using your last bullet for us. Ahmed Hassan." Maria kept the photograph on her desk, a reminder of why service mattered and how individual actions could ripple outward in ways that might never be fully understood. The experience had taught her that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about ordinary people making extraordinary choices when circumstances demanded it. An elderly civilian running toward danger to warn children. A soldier using her last bullet to protect innocents. These were the quiet acts of courage that defined character and made the world a little bit better, one decision at a time. As she settled into her new routine, Maria often thought about the weight of that final shot. In the heat of combat, with children's lives hanging in the balance, the decision had been instinctive. But in the quiet moments of reflection, she understood that it had been shaped by years of training, by values instilled through service, by the understanding that some things were worth risking everything for. The elderly civilian had taught her that courage was universal, that it could emerge from anyone when the moment demanded it. The story of that morning in Afghanistan became part of Maria's personal narrative, a defining moment that shaped how she approached challenges in civilian life. When faced with difficult decisions, she often thought about Hassan's courage and her own choice to use that last bullet. The lesson was clear. When the moment comes to stand up for what's right, to protect the innocent, to risk something for the greater good, you don't hesitate. You act, trusting that your training, your values, and your humanity will guide you to the right choice. Years passed, and Maria built a new life, but the memory of that morning remained vivid. She spoke about it occasionally, when the context was right, when someone needed to understand the weight of service or the reality of moral choices in extreme circumstances. The story always ended the same way. Sometimes the most important decisions are made not in boardrooms or conference halls, but in split seconds when everything depends on doing what's right, even when the cost is high. The elderly civilian who had given his warning, the children who had escaped harm, the soldier who had used her last bullet to protect them, all had played their part in a moment that could have ended very differently. But because each had chosen courage over safety, action over inaction, others over self, the outcome had been different. The school still stood, the children still learned, and the hope for a better future remained alive. In the end, Maria understood that her service had been about more than military objectives or strategic goals. It had been about being ready when moments of moral clarity arrived, about having the courage to act when action was needed, about understanding that individual choices could have profound consequences for others. The last bullet had been just ammunition, but the decision to use it had been an affirmation of values, a statement about who she was and what she stood for. The story continued to influence how Maria approached life's challenges. Whether in her career, her relationships, or her community involvement, she carried the lesson of that morning with her. When someone needed help, when a situation demanded courage, when the easy choice conflicted with the right choice, she remembered the elderly civilian's example and her own decision to use that last bullet. Some things were worth the risk, worth the sacrifice, worth standing up for regardless of the personal cost. The photograph from Hassan remained on her desk, a daily reminder of the difference individual actions could make. The children in the picture were growing up, learning, preparing for futures that might have been cut short if different choices had been made that morning. Their smiles were evidence that courage mattered, that service had meaning, that the decision to use her last bullet to protect civilians had been the right one. In a world often defined by conflict and division, these small acts of heroism provided hope and direction. The airstrike that came later, missing its target by mere inches, served as a stark reminder of how quickly situations could change, how fragile the line between safety and catastrophe really was. But that's another story, one that would further test Maria's resolve and remind her once again that in the chaos of combat, individual choices could mean the difference between life and death, between hope and despair, between the future and its absence.